Hello.
Part 9, 1,000 Needles and the Test. The transition from Feralas into 1,000 Needles was one of the most complete changes of world Can had encountered on the road. Not the gradual arrival of the Barons, which had announced itself in stages through the texture of the air before it arrived in fact, but an immediate and total replacement of one kind of place with another. 6 weeks of canopy and layered green and permanent shade, and then the road came out of the trees at Thalanar, and the world simply stopped being a forest. He walked from a place where the sky had to be searched for into a place that was almost entirely sky. The Needles declared themselves without preamble. They rose from the canyon floor with the authority of things that had been rising from this ground for longer than anything currently living had existed to observe them. Not mountains, which had the heft of accumulated bulk, but something else. Vertical, precise, stone carved away from around them rather than built up, so that what remained was the essential column, pointing at the sky with the patience of something that had been pointing at the sky for geological time and had no intention of stopping. The light between the Needles was a specific light, caught and redirected by the stone faces, arriving at canyon floor level having been changed by the passage. In the early morning, the Needles threw shadows of extraordinary length, and those shadows moved with the slow rotation of the day in a way that turned the canyon into a kind of clock, reading time in the language of stone and sun. Etshaki moved through it with the presentness that had become his signature, including the Needles in his read of the terrain, the way he included all terrain, thoroughly, and without hierarchy. Can looked up often, which was new for him. His natural read of terrain was horizontal, and the Needles required a different orientation, a willingness to tilt the head and follow the stone up to where it ended in open sky. He understood quickly why the Tauren who lived here built upward rather than across the canyon floor. The bridges between the spires explained themselves before anyone needed to explain them to him. He crossed his first one in the early afternoon, a rope and plank construction strung between two needle tops, swaying slightly with his weight and the wind, the canyon floor visible far below through the gaps between the planks. He understood, looking down, what the bridges were for. The canyon floor belonged to the Centaur, the Galak tribe. He would learn the name later, but he did not need the name to read what the floor told him. Worn paths, the signs of mounted patrols moving in patterns that suggested territory rather than passage, the canyon floor a place that travelers crossed quickly or not at all. The bridges themselves carried their own quiet danger. He learned this on the second crossing, when a shadow passed low overhead, and he looked up to find a bird of prey circling with the patient attention of something that had learned travelers on the spans were easier than travelers on the ground. Slower, more exposed, with nowhere to retreat except forward or back along a single narrow line. A trader on the Thalanar road had told him that the larger birds in this canyon had been known to attack the planking itself, working at the lashings with a persistence that suggested intelligence rather than simple hunger, sabotaging a crossing days before anyone attempted it so that the failure, when it came, would come at the worst possible moment for whoever happened to be in the middle of the span. He crossed with the attention this knowledge required, testing each plank's give before committing his full weight, watching the bird's circling pattern for the change in altitude that would mean a strike was beginning rather than simply continuing. Etshaki moving low and balanced beside him with none of the bridge's sway visibly troubling him at all. The bird did not strike. It simply watched them cross, the way a toll keeper watched travelers pass without yet deciding whether a toll was owed, and peeled off toward the canyon floor once they reached solid stone on the far side. He crossed several more in the following hour, the network of spans connecting spire to spire in a route that climbed gradually toward the higher mesas, the Centaur warbands visible at a distance below as moving clusters of dust and motion that the bridges, by design, kept him entirely separate from. He understood by the third crossing that the entire architecture of travel in this canyon had been built around a single fact, that the ground belonged to someone else, and the only way through was above it. There was a second fact, and he read it on the fourth crossing looking down. The canyon floor carried a scour. He could see it from the span, a broad, clean channel running the canyon's length where the loose stone had been swept away, and the ground beneath scraped down to a paler layer. And along its edges, the debris a moving water leaves when it finally lets go of what it has been carrying. Brush packed into rock clefts far above the floor, timber that had not grown anywhere near here, a hide tent's frame folded around a boulder like something wrung out. He had never seen water do this. He had seen the river at Camp Narek in the spring, running high and brown and fast, and it had been a large thing behaving like itself. This was water behaving like a landslide. He understood then what Tarka had been unable to finish saying in Faralas. It had come down the canyon in the dark, and the canyon had held it and concentrated it and given it somewhere to go, and everything living at the bottom had been at the bottom. The bridges, he thought, had not been built for the centaur alone. He arrived eventually within sight of a settlement, built on a natural stone shelf well above the canyon floor. Freewind Post had the energy of a place that served several functions at once, and had arranged itself around all of them, without prioritizing any single one. Torin moved through its small spaces with the practiced navigation of people who had learned the geometry of a settlement, built on a shelf rather than a plain. A wind rider master kept his charges at the platform's edge, wyverns, tawny and heavy-shouldered, the great cat bodies folded down around their wings, and the barbed tails curled in close, watching the comings and goings with an alertness that had nothing docile in it. Supply vendors worked from stalls set close to the structures, leaving little open ground to spare. The post was carrying more people than it was built to carry. That was legible immediately. Bedrolls stacked in the lee of the storehouse, cook fires burning at hours no settled kitchen would burn them, families sleeping in a shelter that had clearly been something else last season. The ones from the floor, a supply vendor named Thalia Amberhide told him, when he bought powder from her and asked. Everything below is gone. What walked out is here, and here was already full. She said it without complaint, in the tone of someone who had been dividing too little among too many for weeks, and had stopped expecting the numbers to improve. And then she short-changed herself on the powder, and pretended not to notice when he pointed it out. A small grey wolf pup attached itself to him on his second hour at the post. It came out from under the storehouse platform with the specific confidence of an animal that had learned this settlement had no dangerous corners in it, and made directly for Etchiaki. Not cautiously, not with the deference smaller predators generally offered larger ones, but with the whole-body enthusiasm of something that had not yet been taught which animals were beyond its social reach. Kan watched with real interest to see what the white lion would do. Etchiaki lowered his head and let the pup put its front paws on his muzzle, and held absolutely still. And then, when the pup's confidence had escalated to the point of biting his ear, lifted one enormous paw and put it flat on the pup's back and pressed it gently to the ground and held it there until it stopped. Then released it. The pup came back immediately and did the same thing again and received the same correction. And by the fourth repetition, the two of them had arrived at a game with rules that neither Kan nor anyone else at the post had been consulted about. She belongs to the post, an old brave said, watching. Belongs to all of it and none of it. Her mother came up from the floor and did not last the week. He watched the pup fail once more to bite the lion's ear. That one does not know she is an orphan. There is a mercy in the not knowing that I would not take from her. She slept against Etchiaki's flank that night, and against his flank every night that followed, and nobody at the post ever discussed the arrangement or appeared to find it worth discussing. He had felt it on his first walk through the post, before the pup and before the powder. The tension Tarka's account in Faralas had only partly prepared him for. More than one person at the post's edge looked northwest with the particular wariness of people checking a direction rather than admiring a view, and when he followed the look he found the reason. Another mesa, taller and more isolated, dark against the afternoon sky. He asked a passing Tauren brave what it was. Dark Cloud Pinnacle, the brave said. He did not elaborate, and the not elaborating was its own kind of information. The same reserve Kan had learned to read from Tarka and from Vex at the crossroads. The mark of people who had decided a subject required more care than a stranger's curiosity deserved on a first asking. He found a more complete account that evening from an older brave named Hagar Lightninghoof, who sat at the post's edge in the manner of someone who had earned the right to sit and watch rather than work, and who answered the question with more patience than the younger brave had offered. Dark Cloud Pinnacle belongs to the Grim Totem now, Hagar said. It was not always theirs. He looked at the dark mesa for a while before continuing. There was a woman taken from this post, Lakota Windsong. Her name was taken against her will by their chieftain because she refused him, and her brother killed when he came for her. He said this plainly, without performance, the way Vex had told Can about Kraz. The flatness of someone reporting a true and ugly thing without dressing it in more drama than it already carried on its own. Can said, I encountered some of them. In Faralas. He did not say more than that, uncertain yet what more there was to say. Hagar looked at him with new interest. What were they like, he asked, in a way that made clear he was asking about something particular rather than making conversation. Can thought about the broken totem fragment in his pack, and the young woman with the shallow cut on her forearm who had asked him, You are Horde, and had not been satisfied with his answer. Frightened, he said finally. Driven from somewhere south of here. Not everything the word Grimtotem means is the same thing everywhere it is found, I think. Hagar was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that may be true. It does not change what Arnak Grimtotem did to Lakota or to her brother. He looked at Can. But I have lived long enough to know that a tribe and the man leading it are not always saying the same thing, even when the tribe lets him speak for it. Can did not have an answer to this that resolved anything, and did not pretend to one. He thanked Hagar for the account, and sat with it the way he sat with most things the road gave him that did not arrive at a clean conclusion. Present, unresolved, carried forward rather than set down. Dorn Plainstalker kept to a cave on the canyon's northern cliff face, a hollow worn into the stone that the locals called the Weathered Nook, and Can found him there on his second day at the post, sitting in the cave's mouth with a stillness that Can recognized across a distance before he had resolved any of the details. Dorn was old in the way Greywind was old, the kind of old that had arrived at simplification through the patient elimination of everything that was not essential. His face carried the record of decades of altitude and wind and sun. The eyes settled into a stillness that was no longer something he practiced, but something he had become. He looked at Can with the frank, unhurried manner of someone who was going to form an accurate opinion, and was not going to be rushed into forming it before it was ready. He looked at ASHWALLOW for a long time. Then he said, You are here for the testing. It was not a question. Can had announced nothing. Can said, What testing? Dorn's attention came off ASHWALLOW and settled on him, and Can understood that the question had been correct, and that it had also been the beginning of something. You did not know, Dorn said. Not a correction. An observation being filed. I did not, Can said. I came into this canyon because the road came into this canyon. He paused and then gave the rest of it, because giving less than the truth to this particular old man seemed obviously pointless. And because someone in Faralas said 1,000 needles was where people found out what they were made of, and I have been walking a long time without any way to check. Dorn was quiet for a moment. There are 4 facets to a person, he said. The spirit. The body, which is 2 things, not one, though most people never learn the difference until something makes them learn it. And the mind. He looked out at the needles. I have spent 30 years putting young people in front of places that ask about one facet at a time, and watching what the place gets back. Can said, What for? Not for anything, Dorn said. That is the part most of them cannot hear. There is no rank at the end. Nobody hands you a title. You do not become a better hunter for having done it, and if you were going to fail one of them, you were already failing it every day out on the road, quietly, in ways nobody was measuring. He turned his head. The tests do not make you anything. They only stop you being able to tell yourself you do not know. Can sat with that. He said, How many do I have to take? 1, Dorn said. Then, if you want the next, 1 more. He said it flatly. I will not lay the whole road out in front of you, and let you decide about it from a comfortable distance. That is not what any of them are like. I will name the first. You will do it or not do it. If you do it and you still want to go further, I will name the second. Not before. And if I stop after the first? Then you stop after the first, Dorn said with no weight on it at all. Some people should. Some of the ones who should not do. I have stopped being able to tell which is which from the outside, and I stopped trying some years ago. Can said, Can you tell me anything about them? No, Dorn said. Nothing. Nothing, Dorn said. Anything I told you would be the thing you prepared against, and preparing against it is exactly what the place is built to find. He gestured at the ledge outside the cave mouth, the whole canyon below it. Sit out there as long as you need. I am not going anywhere, and neither is the canyon. So Can sat. He sat on the ledge outside the Weathered Nook for the better part of the afternoon, with Etchaki stretched along the warm stone beside him and the needles throwing their long clock shadows across the floor below, and did the thing he had learned to do with decisions that mattered, which was not to decide, but to sit with the decision until it stopped changing shape. He noticed first that he was looking for a reason to say yes, and made himself examine that. He had come a long way. He had learned a craft, and then a harder version of the same craft, and had killed things that could have killed him, and had been correct about most of the ground he had read. It would be pleasant to have that confirmed by an old man who had confirmed it for others. That was vanity, or something adjacent to vanity, and it was not sufficient. He noticed second that he was afraid in a low and unspecific way, and made himself examine that too, and found it more interesting. He was not afraid of any particular test, because he did not know what any of them were. He was afraid of the answer. There was a version of himself he had been carrying since Camp Narake, capable, steady, sufficient, and he had never once had it checked against anything that could return a verdict. The road had been generous. The road had let him be that version continuously for a year, without ever asking whether it was accurate. He thought about the cliff at Shadowpree and the arithmetic that had come up short, and about Etchaki refusing the one order that mattered, and understood that he had already been checked once without consenting to it, and had not liked what the checking felt like. This would be the same thing offered rather than inflicted. That seemed, on examination, like a better arrangement, not a worse one. And then he arrived at the thing that actually decided it, which was smaller than he expected. He did not want to walk east out of this canyon, knowing that an old man had offered to show him the truth about himself, and he had declined the offer because he preferred the version he already had. The light had gone long and orange by the time he came back into the cave mouth. Dorn had not moved. Name the first one, Can said. Dorn looked at him for a moment, and there was something in the look that was not approval. Can would think about this later and decide it had been closer to recognition, the particular attention of a man noting which of the two usual kinds of yes he had just been given. Faith, Dorn said. We begin with the spirit, because the spirit is the only facet that asks something before you have had the chance to prove anything else about yourself. The other three reward what you have already built. Faith does not care what you have built. It only asks whether you will act on what you cannot verify. Can said when. Dorn said you have just spent an afternoon deciding. That was the last preparation you were going to get. Now, he stood at the top of one of the needles, on a platform of weathered planks jutting out from the stone at a height that made the canyon floor a distant abstraction rather than a destination, and Dorn's instruction had been short enough to repeat exactly in his own mind. Jump, if you have faith. Nothing further. No description of what waited below, no assurance about the landing, no explanation of how the fall would resolve. Dorn had given him the instruction, and then simply waited, with the patience of someone who had given this exact instruction more times than he could easily count, and had learned that elaboration would only complicate what the test was actually asking. Can stood at the edge and looked down and felt the fear arrive with the complete honesty of someone who had decided, somewhere on the road behind him, that feeling things honestly was more useful than managing them away. The fear was not irrational. It was the accurate response of a body that understood the physics of falling and had formed a correct assessment of what falling from this height usually meant. He did not have evidence here. He did not have 14 mornings of watching others jump and building a model from observation, the way he had built his understanding of the rake. He did not have weeks of proximity, the way his trust in Etchaki had grown. He had only Dorn's instruction and the history of an old man who had clearly survived administering this same test to people before him, which was not nothing, but was also not verification. He thought of Tamer at the river the morning before he left Camp Narake, saying, "Someday you will go find out." Not a challenge. A recognition that not knowing was a condition that could change if you were willing to move toward the not knowing, instead of away from it. He thought of his mother's hands on his face. Come back changed. Not lost. There is a difference. He was afraid and he stepped off the edge anyway. The fall was brief and disorienting, the way falls were, the canyon wheeling past at the edge of his vision, the wind taking the breath out of any thought that was not directly relevant to the present instant. And then the world reassembled itself with a suddenness that took him a moment to understand. He was standing in the mouth of Dorn's cave. He had not climbed. He had not walked. He had jumped from a platform a significant height above the canyon floor, and the next thing his body registered was solid stone under his feet, and Dorn sitting exactly where Dorn had been sitting before, looking at him with the same unhurried attention. Can stood very still, his pulse working through what his body had correctly identified as a genuine fall, and understood slowly what had actually happened, that some working of magic or spirit beyond his understanding had carried him back the instant the jump was committed, that the test had never been about surviving an impact at all. He said, "I did not know that would happen." "No," Dorn said. "That is rather the point." Can sat with this. He said the fear did not know either. "No," Dorn said again. "The fear is never given the whole picture. That is what makes it fear rather than calculation." He looked at Can for a long moment. "You jumped without knowing what waited. That is the entire test. Whatever waited was always going to be beside the point." Can thought about this for a while, sitting in the cave's mouth with his pulse settling. He said eventually, "I have done something like this before." Without entirely deciding to. Dorn said, "Most people have if they look honestly enough at their own road." He paused. "Most people do not look honestly enough." Can went back out to the ledge afterward, and sat where he had sat during the deciding and let it finish arriving. What he found, turning it over, was not what he expected to find. He had assumed the test would tell him something about his courage, whether he had it, how much, whether it would hold. It had told him nothing about that. What it had told him was about the relationship between two things he had always understood as opposites. He had thought before the platform that acting well meant getting the fear out of the way first. That was what all his training had implied: settle the breath, quiet the body, then move. And the platform had made that impossible. There had been no version of standing at that edge where the fear settled, because the fear had been correct, and correct fear does not settle. So he had gone with it still fully present, still shouting the accurate physics of the drop at him, and the going had worked anyway. Which meant the fear had never been the obstacle. It had only been the weather. He had been waiting, his whole life, for a condition to pass that was never going to pass, and calling the waiting preparation. He sat with that until the light changed on the needles. He felt, when he stood up, marginally larger than he had been that morning. Not stronger. Larger, as though a wall he had assumed was the edge of the room had turned out to be a curtain, and behind it there was more room, and the room had always been that size. Dorn let 2 days pass before he said anything further, and did not explain the 2 days, and Can did not ask. On the third morning, the old man was waiting at the cave mouth when he came up the ramp. "You want the second," Dorn said. "Yes. Endurance," Dorn said. "The first half of the body." He stood with the careful restraint of significant age. West of the post, in the southern wall, there is a canyon the locals call Screeching, and a den in it the harpies call their own. Rogefeather. They keep food stores there in quantities no nest that size should be able to accumulate, which tells you something about what they have been doing to sustain those quantities, and about how long the floor has been unsafe for reasons that have nothing to do with Centaur. Go into it. Destroy what they have stored. Their leader is called Grenka Bloodscreech, and she will not permit the destroying, and that is the test. Can said, "Is there anything else I should know before I go into that den?" Dorn looked at him with the first thing approaching amusement Can had seen on him. "There is," he said. "And I am not going to tell you. You will know it by the end of the day. Everyone does. Nobody has ever needed it explained to them afterward. Screeching Canyon earned its name from a long way off. The crossing to it took most of a morning, 3 spire bridges, and then a long descent along a ledge the harpies clearly used as their own approach. The stone streaked white with generations of habitation, the smell of a place that had been a nest longer than it had been anything else. The calls came down off the rock in overlapping layers, and Can stopped twice on the descent to listen to the structure of them, and did not like what the structure told him. They were not calling at random. They were calling to each other about him, and the pattern of it moved and reorganized as he moved. The den entrance was a ramp of broken stone rising into dark. He went in the way Braka had taught him to go into any place with one door. Slowly, with the door behind him mapped before the dark ahead of him was, Etshaki at his left where the wall would not let anything come. The first ones took him at the entrance and were easy, and that was the last easy thing the day produced. He found the stores 40 paces in. Dried meat, grain sacks, travel bread, the accumulated take of years of ambushes, stacked with the crude efficiency of creatures that hoarded rather than used. Some of it bore the marks of the caravans it had come out of. Some of it had been in the dark long enough to be worthless to anything. He set about the destruction methodically, the way Dorn had asked and understood about a third of the way through that the destruction was not the test either. It was the summons. They came in waves. The first wave was 4, and he took them with the gun and the axe in a fighting order that felt, at the time, like competence. The entrance chamber's low ceiling denying them the diving attacks that were their whole advantage, Etshaki holding the left where the chamber narrowed, the two of them working the geometry they had built across a year of ground. The second wave was 7, and they had learned from the first. They came low and wide, and did not commit all at once, and one of them got past his guard on the blind side and opened a line across his shoulder before Etshaki took it out of the air. The third wave was more than he could count in the dark, and it was the third wave that taught him what the word endurance had been doing in Dorn's sentence. It was not about the fighting. He could fight. It was about what fighting did to a body over time, and how the fighting did not stop to let the body catch up. His arms began to report their weight to him. The gun's reload, which his hands could do in the dark without consulting him, began to require consulting him. The half-second of read and decide that separated him from things that only reacted began to stretch, and he felt it stretching, and could do nothing about the stretching except keep making decisions inside a window that was closing. He lost track of the waves somewhere after the 4th. There was a stretch, he could not afterwards say how long, and suspected the not being able to say was itself part of what had been measured, where the whole world reduced to the cave's noise and the reek of the nest, and a sequence of arrivals he met one after another with less and less left, and the only 2 facts still fully present in his mind were the wall at his back and the white shape working the ground in front of him. He was bleeding from the shoulder, and from a deep tear along the outside of his left thigh where something had come in under his guard, while he was answering something else. Etshaki had a gash down one flank that was leaving a mark on the stone every time he set that foot. Neither of them had stopped. And then the waves stopped, and Can understood immediately that this was worse. She came down the ramp from the deep chamber, and the den went quiet around her. Grenka Bloodscreech was half again the size of the largest thing he had killed that day, and moved with the terrible leisure of something that had never once had to hurry. And Can, standing against the wall with his lungs working like a bellows and his left leg, reporting that it would take his weight for a while yet, but had opinions about how long, did the arithmetic for the second time in his life. It came out the same way it had come out on the cliff at Shadowpree. He had 1 shot loaded, and probably 1 more after it if his hands would cooperate. He had an axe and an arm that was slower than the arm he had walked in with. He had a lion who was bleeding and would not leave. And he had a doorway 40 paces behind him that he was not going to reach on this leg with that thing in the air. He did not signal Etshaki to run. He had learned on a cliff above the sea what that signal was worth, and he was not going to insult either of them by giving it again. He raised the gun instead. The shot took her high in the chest and did not stop her. She came the last of the distance and hit him with a force that put him off the wall and onto the floor of the den with his shoulder screaming and the gun gone somewhere into the dark. And he got the axe up in time to keep the first strike off his throat and not in time to keep it off his forearm. and then she was on him with her full weight and the world narrowed to a very small set of facts. ASHWALLOW hit her from the side. Not with speed. With the whole of what he was, held back from nothing. And it moved her off Can's chest by a body's width, and it cost him, because she turned inside the movement and opened his flank a second time, and he made a sound Can had never heard him make in a year of walking. But it was a body's width, and it was a half second, and Can had spent the entire road learning what to do with a half second. He got the axe into the join where her wing met her body, with everything he had left in an arm that had nothing left in it. And then he got it in again, and the second one was worse than the first, and she came apart from her own momentum somewhere in the middle of it, and the two of them went down together onto the den floor and did not get up at the same time. He lay there for a while. He was aware of the ceiling, and of the fact that the noise had stopped, and of ASHWALLOW dragging himself the 4 paces between them and lying down against his side with his weight settling in slowly. The way it settled every night at every fire, as though this were simply where the evening had arrived. Can put his hand into the white fur and left it there, and let himself have a full minute of not being anything but alive. Then he made himself sit up, because the alternative was to keep lying in a harpy den in the dark, bleeding, in a place where more of them might yet come, and because his mother's voice was already saying the thing it always said. He worked on the lion first. That was not a decision either. It had the same quality the axe swing had, of a thing his hands were doing while his mind was still assembling the case for it. He packed the flank wounds with what the kit carried, and closed the worse of the two with the fine stitching Sierra's leatherwork had trained into his fingers years before either of them could have named what the training was for, and ASHWALLOW held entirely still throughout with his gold eyes on Can's face, and did not make the sound again. Then he did what he could for himself, which was less than what needed doing. The forearm he could close. The thigh he could pack and bind and no more. The shoulder he could not reach properly at all, and he got the binding around it one-handed with his teeth in the knot, and understood that it would hold for a walk and would not hold for a fight. He took Grenka's claw because Dorn had asked for proof, and the asking had been honest. And then he walked out of the rogue feather den into an afternoon that seemed absurdly bright, with a lion limping at his left side, and a leg that had begun to argue in earnest, and started the long way back up. The return took him until well past dark. He did not remember most of it afterward, the ledge, the 3 bridges, the last climb to the Weathered Nook, except for the last hour, when the question had stopped being about harpies and become entirely about distance, and he had discovered that a body which has already spent everything can still be negotiated within small amounts if you are honest with it about how much further. And except for the hollow at the base of the 3rd spire. He almost walked past it. He was moving badly by then, and looking at the ground directly in front of his feet, which was the only reason he saw it at all. A scatter of equipment in a rock cleft below the span, half absorbed into the terrain, the way things are absorbed when they have been part of a landscape long enough to stop announcing themselves as separate from it. It was the configuration that caught him. Gear does not fall in that arrangement. It falls in that arrangement when somebody is still inside it. He counted 3 before the light went. He stood on the bridge above them for a while with his leg shaking under him and understood, with the flat clarity that exhaustion sometimes gave him in place of feeling, that he could do nothing about this tonight, and that doing nothing about it tonight was not the same as doing nothing about it. Travelers or testers before him. The harpies had been stripping the spans for years, and depositing what they stripped where it fell. Then he went on up because there was no other available choice. Dorn was at the cave mouth when he came up the ramp. The old man was on his feet before Can had fully arrived, and there was nothing unhurried about him at all, and Can registered dimly that this was the first time he had seen Dorn Plainstalker move quickly. "Sit down," Dorn said. "On the stone." Now, Can sat down on the stone. What Dorn did then was not anything Can had a vocabulary for. The old man put one hand flat on the ground and the other on the lion first. Can noticed that, and thought about it for a long time afterward, that the order had not needed discussing, and something came up out of the canyon floor and through him and into the animal, and the bleeding stopped. Not slowed. Stopped in the way a thing stops when the argument it was having with the world has been settled by a higher authority. Then he did the same to Can, and Can felt his shoulder resolve itself, and his thigh, and the deep exhausted ache in the arms drain out through the stone as though it had only ever been water that had needed somewhere lower to go. Can said when he could, "You did not tell me you could do that." "You did ask," Dorn said. He sat back on his heels, and he was breathing harder than he had been. "This was not what I was keeping from you, but you did ask, and I would have refused this too. And if I had told you, you would have gone into that den knowing there was a flaw under you. There is no flaw. There was never a flaw. I can mend what walks back up my ramp. I have never once been able to mend what does not." He looked at Can for a long moment. "9 did not walk back up," he said. "In 30 years. He rose with the careful restraint of significant age. "I mention it because you are going to feel proud of yourself in about an hour, and I would rather the pride had the correct shape." Can gave him the claw. Dorn examined it and nodded once, and set it aside without ceremony. He slept 11 hours, and sat on the ledge most of the following day, and the conclusion he arrived at was not the one he had gone looking for. He had expected to feel something about survival, relief, or the thin high pleasure of a near thing that had come out his way. He found almost none of that. What he found instead was a correction to something he had believed about himself for as long as he had believed anything. He had always understood his own capability as a quantity. A fixed amount of hunter, carried around, spent down over the course of a hard day and restored by a night's sleep. That was how he had planned every difficult thing he had ever done. Estimate the cost, check it against the amount, proceed if the amount was sufficient. The den had exceeded the amount in the first hour, and he had continued for 6. Which meant the amount had never been the real quantity. The real quantity was something else, how far past the amount he was willing to keep making decisions, and what the quality of those decisions was once past it. That was not something a body possessed. That was something a body did repeatedly while running on nothing, and it could not be estimated in advance because it did not exist until it was called for. He thought about what Dorn had refused to tell him at the cave mouth, and understood it now without needing it explained, exactly as the old man had said he would. There was what a body could bring to bear, all at once, against the thing in front of it. And there was what remained of that body after everything it could bring had already been spent. They lived in the same body and were not the same facet, and only one of them had ever been tested on the open road, because the open road had always, eventually, let him stop. This was what endurance had meant. He had walked in thinking it meant the first thing, and underneath that, quieter and less comfortable, a second thing. He had signalled Etchaki to flee once, on a cliff above the sea, and had been refused, and had spent months since then treating that refusal as a beautiful fact about his companion. In the den, he had not given the signal at all. He had simply stopped believing it was available. Somewhere between Shadowpree and Screeching Canyon, the two of them had stopped being a hunter and an animal who chose to stay, and become a single thing with two bodies that could be hurt separately. He was not sure this was wise. He was entirely sure it was true. He felt, sitting there, more complete than he had felt in Ferala's, and understood that the completing was not addition. It was the removal of a wrong idea he had been carrying in the place where an accurate one should have been. He went up to the cave that evening and found Dorn where Dorn always was. "The third test waits whenever you are ready for it," the old man said. "There is something I would like to do first," Can said. He explained what he had found on the crossing and what he intended to do about it. Dorn was quiet for a long moment, studying him with an attention that took as long as it needed to take. He said, "Nobody asked you to do that." "No," Can said. Dorn said, "There is time. Go." He went back across the bridges the following morning, with a length of canvas Thalia Amberhide sold him without asking what it was for, and spent the day doing what needed to be done. He worked without ritual, because he had no tradition he was certain would mean the right thing to people whose own traditions he did not know, and worked instead with the deliberate attention that was its own form of respect, treating each set of remains as belonging to someone who had been attempting something difficult and had not been able to complete it, which deserved a kind of consideration that was not pity. He buried them together on a shelf of open stone near the canyon's rim, above the reach of anything that came down the floor in the dark, and set a cairn over the place, and a second smaller one a dozen paces off in the line of the ledge, so that anyone who came looking for a missing traveller would find the marker before he found the grave, and would be given the half-minute of warning that such a finding deserved. He sat beside it for a while when he was done, not praying, not performing grief, simply present with what had happened there. Then he returned to the post and told Dorn it was finished. Before he went back to the cave to ask for the third, he went west with an egg party, because Thalia Amberhide mentioned they were short a gun, and because he had begun to understand that what the post was short of, it was short of for everybody. High Pitch was a plateau in the western canyon, reached by a switchback path that a laden tauren could climb in about an hour, and a wyvern could cover in under a minute, which was the central fact of the place and governed everything about how the party moved on it. The wyverns held it, and had held it for longer than the post had existed. They were not tame and had never been tame. They were enormous and tawny, and built along the lines of a thing that had decided to be both cat and storm, and their nests were tucked into the plateau's broken upper shelves, and they defended those shelves with an intelligence Can found genuinely unsettling. Not the territorial fury of the Ferala's dragonkin, which had been simple and total, but coordination, sentries, a clear preference for taking the last member of a line rather than the first. "We take from the outer nests only," said the young brave beside him, a wind rider apprentice named Elu who was still working toward his full training, and who carried the eggs the way other people carried water. Only what a nest can afford to lose and still continue. Never the last of a clutch. Never twice from the same shelf in a season. He said it without being asked, in the manner of someone who had explained it often enough that the explanation had become a kind of habit. And Can noticed that he said it while looking up, and kept looking up, and had not stopped looking up since they reached the plateau. Can spent most of the ascent watching the sky with the gun ready and firing twice, both times to turn a stoop rather than to kill, which Elu thanked him for afterward in a way that made clear the distinction mattered here. They came off the shelves at midday with 4 eggs and no injuries, which Elu said was a good day, and which Can understood from the way he said it, to be a considerably better than average day. It was on the descent, at the plateau's southeastern edge, that they found the tauren. He had been up there 8 days. His name was Pauka Swiftmountain, and he had come for eggs alone, which he admitted immediately and without any attempt to dress it up. And the wyverns had cut him off from the path, and he had spent 8 days in a cleft in the rock with a broken bow and a water skin he had made last far longer than it should have lasted. He was not badly hurt. He was hollowed out in the way of a man who had spent 8 days counting what he had left and watching the count come out smaller each morning. Can and Elu got him downs. It took 4 hours to cover an hour of path, because he could not move quickly, and the wyverns knew precisely what a slow group meant. They went with Pauka in the middle and Elu ahead, and Can behind with the gun, and Etshaki ranging the upslope side where the stoops would come from. And Can learned something on that descent about a kind of work he had never done before, that escorting was not hunting, that the entire discipline of it was subordinating his own pace and his own read of the ground to the pace of the person he was protecting, and that everything in him wanted to move faster, and every instance of wanting was a thing to be identified and set down. He fired 4 times and killed twice. Etshaki turned one off Pauka's back that Can never saw coming and would not have reached. They put him on the southeastern path with water and dried meat, and he said he would make Whitereach Post by dark, and he stopped before he started walking and said the thing that people said when they had run out of other ways to say it. "I have a brother at Whitereach," he said. "If you come through, say the name." He looked at the plateau behind them. "I am going to come back up here. Not for eggs." He seemed to find this as strange as Can did. Somebody should be watching what happens on that rock. It should not be a place people simply go and do not come off. That evening Can sat with Elu while he checked the 4 eggs, turning each one with a gentleness that seemed almost incongruous given the size of his hands. "You have a lion that hunts beside you," Elu said. "Is it the same with him? Do you take only what he can afford to give?" Can thought about this. He said it has never felt like taking with him. He chose what he gives. Elu considered this with apparent interest. "That is different," he said. "The wyverns did not choose us. We took them off the shelves before they could choose anything, and then we raise what hatches to trust us because trusting us is what they have always known. He turned another egg with the same careful precision. I have wondered sometimes whether that is the same thing in the end, or a different thing wearing the same name. Can did not have a ready answer. He said, I do not know. I think the difference might be larger than it looks from outside either relationship. Ilu nodded slowly, as if filing the answer away rather than fully accepting or rejecting it, and returned to his work, and Can sat a while longer in the gathering dusk, thinking about a man who had spent 8 days in a cleft in the rock and had come down off it having decided to go back. Strength, Dorn said, when Can came to the cave to ask for the third. The other half of the body. He was quiet a moment. This one you may take help for. I say that to everyone and almost nobody does it, and I have stopped pretending the saying is anything but a formality. He told Can about the elemental before he sent him after it, and the telling was longer than anything Dorn had said about the first 2 tests combined. There was an age, he said, when elementals held most of this world and served the old gods, and were bound here by the power of the things they served. When the old gods were put down, the elementals went out of the world with them, and what comes back now comes back because some mage has spent a great deal of effort insisting on it. He looked out at the canyons. A few were strong enough to stay without being insisted upon. One of them is in the eastern stretch of this canyon. Rokalimth. The centaur call him the Pounder, for the sound his fists make on whatever is unlucky enough to be standing in front of them, and the centaur are not a people much given to giving names to things they can simply kill. Can said, why tell me the history? Because the 4th facet is the mind, Dorn said, and did not elaborate further, and Can understood that he had just been given something and would find out later what it was. Rokalim prowled the canyon's eastern stretch. Old and enormous and made of the same stone, the needles themselves were carved from, as though the canyon had decided at some point to produce a guardian out of its own material, rather than continue relying on creatures that merely lived on it. Finding the elemental took the better part of a day on its own. Rokalim did not occupy a fixed den the way the harpies had occupied their cave, but ranged across a wide stretch of broken ground east of the post, and Can tracked its passage the way he tracked anything that moved without leaving an obvious trail. The disturbance in loose stone that nothing smaller could produce, the absence of the usual small desert creatures in a radius too large to be coincidence, the particular hush that preceded the elemental's presence the way pre-ambush silence preceded an ambush, except slower, heavier, the silence of something the desert itself seemed to be holding its breath around. He found it finally in the late afternoon, standing motionless in a dry wash with the stillness that was indistinguishable at a glance from the surrounding stone, and understood, looking at it, why Dorn had suggested company. It was larger than anything he had fought since the rake's territory had first taught him what large could mean, the proportions of something built rather than born, each limb a slab of the canyon's own bedrock, animated by whatever force had given it purpose. He fought it with Etchaki at his side, and without the additional hands Dorn had suggested, and he had thought about the asking for most of the previous evening before deciding against it. The post had 19 braves and more mouths than it could feed, and every one of those braves was already spending his days on work that kept other people alive. Can could not find a way to phrase the request that did not come out as asking men who had nothing to spare to spend a day on a test that was his and nobody else's. He was aware later that this reasoning had been sound and had also been convenient, and that he had not examined which of the two it was until the examining could no longer change anything. It was the hardest physical test the road had given him. The elemental moved with the slow, irresistible momentum of something that did not need speed, because nothing it struck needed striking twice, each blow carrying the accumulated weight of stone given purpose. And on the 2 occasions, he failed to fully clear its reach. The impact landed with a force that nothing in his prior experience had fully prepared his body to absorb. He felt, in the clarity that came from being struck by something far larger than himself, the actual difference between strength that had been tested against real resistance and strength that had only ever been exercised against cooperative conditions. He used the staff to manage distance in a way the axe could not, the longer reach giving him the half-second of separation that Rokalim's deliberate, telegraphed strikes made survivable if you read them early enough, and moved decisively once you had. He used the axe in the brief windows the staff bought him, aiming for the seams in the stone construction where Harana's anatomical instruction, given for an entirely different material, but the underlying principle that every constructed thing had weaker points where its parts joined, transferring cleanly enough, told him the integrity would be lowest. Etshaki found the openings that speed alone could find, the brief windows between the elemental's enormous, deliberate movements, where a body without the gap between deciding and being could do what a body with that gap could not. Darting in to worry at the same seams, Kan was working and retreating before the answering blow arrived. Between the two of them, across an engagement that left Kan with bruises he would feel for days and a respect for the elemental that outlasted the fight itself, the construct came apart into the fragments Dorn had asked for, not all at once, but in stages, each section of the great stone body losing its animation as the working that held it together finally failed, until what remained on the dry wash floor was simply stone again, inert. Indistinguishable from any other broken rock in the canyon, except for the fact that Kan now knew its history. He carried the fragments back across the bridges in the late afternoon light, arriving at the Weathered Nook with the heavy, emptied fatigue of a man who had gone somewhere past his own limit and would need a while to work out what that meant. Dorn looked at the fragments for a long moment, and then at Kan, and was quiet in the way that meant he was arriving at something rather than simply pausing. He said, "They finish and they go." He paused. Completion was the goal, and the goal was achieved, and everything else was beside the point. That is most of them. It is not a criticism. It is only most of them. He looked at Kan with the specific accuracy of a man who had been reading people for longer than Kan had been alive. "You completed the endurance test," he said. "And then you went back across the bridges to bury people you did not know, for no reason anyone would have held against you if you had simply walked past them." He was quiet a moment longer. "That is not something the tests measure," he said. "That is simply what you are." Kan received this with the stillness he brought to things delivered by people who meant exactly what they said. He sat on the ledge again that evening, because it had become the place where he did this, and worked at the third one until it gave. Strength had been the test he was least afraid of, and the one that had unsettled him most, and it took him some hours to locate why. It was not the two blows that had landed. It was the discovery on the other side of them, that he had found his actual limit, gone through it, and found more country behind it. That should have been a pleasant finding. It was not entirely. It meant that the map he carried of himself had been wrong in a direction that flattered him less than being wrong the other way would have. Because if his limits had been further out than he believed, then every previous time he had stopped at a boundary he had invented. He did not think this obligated him to never stop. He was fairly sure that reading it that way was how people got themselves killed. But it changed the meaning of stopping. Stopping was now a decision he was making rather than a wall he was meeting, and decisions could be examined afterward, and walls could not. 3 facets, he thought. The spirit that acts without verification. The body that brings everything it has. The body that continues after everything it has is gone. There was a 4th. Dorn had touched it twice and had never once offered it. He asked the following morning. Dorn was quiet for long enough that Kan thought the answer might be no. Then he said, "Law. The mind. And it is not mine to give." He turned from the canyon. "I know a great deal," he said. "I have known it a long time, and knowing it has not made me the person who is permitted to ask you about it. The mind is not tested by a man who likes you sitting in a cave you have already climbed to 4 times. It is tested by going where the answers are, and finding out that the answers are held by people who have no reason to make it easy, and that some of them are held nowhere at all anymore, and that a great deal of what you were taught at a fire in Mulgore is a shape somebody made out of what survived." Kan said, "Where?" "Not here," Dorn said. That was all of it. Kan waited, and it became apparent that the waiting was not going to be rewarded, and then it became apparent that the not rewarding was the point. "I will give you the one piece that is mine to give," Dorn said. "It is not in this canyon, and it is not on any road I can point to from this ledge, and you will not walk out of here tomorrow and begin it. Anything past that you would carry east as an expectation. This is the facet that punishes expectations. Can sat with this. He said, then I do not take it. Not now, Dorn said. That is not the same as not taking it. He said, it is the only one of the four that will wait. The spirit, the body, those are asked by a place, and a place asks once, while you are standing in it. The mind is asked by a question, and a question does not care how long you take to come back to it. He looked out at the needles. You will be somewhere at some point, with a lawkeeper in front of you and time in your hands. When you are, you will remember that this one is open. That is all the test needs from you for now. Can said, how will I know I have started it? You will know you have started it, Dorn said, the first time you are told something about your own people that you did not want to be true, and you go and check it instead of setting it down. He said, go. You have what you came here for, and something besides that you did not come here for, which is usually the better thing to leave with. He paused at the cave mouths. And you have one thing you did not get, which is worth more than people think. Most who walk out of here believe they are finished. You know exactly which facet of yourself has not been examined. Carry that. It is better company than certainty. He did not leave the following morning. He sat at the post's northwestern edge instead, where the braves looked when they were checking a direction rather than admiring a view, and looked at the dark mesa for a long time, and then went and found Hagar Lightning Hoof. He said, is she alive? Hagar did not pretend to misunderstand which she. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, 11 days ago a Grim Totem came down to trade and let it slip that Arnak keeps a cage on the summit and that there is somebody in it. He looked at his hands. We have discussed it. We are 19 fighting braves, holding a post full of people who came up off the floor with nothing. If we go to that mesa in the numbers it would take, and we are wrong about the numbers, there is no post here afterward. He looked up. I am not asking you to go. I know, Can said. I am telling you that if you go as one hunter and a lion, and that is not a rescue, that is a theft. He said it flatly. A theft can work. 19 braves cannot. Can went up the eastern face in the dark, because the eastern face was the one Arnak's people did not watch, on the reasoning that nothing came up it. He was 3 hours climbing, and 1 hour lying flat on the summit's rim, reading the camps, rhythm the way he had read the rake's territory for 14 mornings. And what he found was that a camp holding a prisoner, it is certain of guards the prisoner casually, and the approaches heavily, which was the entire opening the night had to offer. The cage was hide and lashed pole, and it took his knife 11 strokes. Lakota Windsong had been in it for a long time. She did not ask who he was. She looked at the open side of the cage, and then at the white lion standing at the rim of the firelight, and then she said, in a voice that had not been used much recently, I can walk. Do not carry me. If you carry me, you cannot fight. They were half the descent down when the mesa woke up behind them. It came in waves, the way the den had come in waves, and it came from above, which the den had not. Grim Totem coming down the switchbacks in 3s and 4s with the confidence of people descending their own mountain in the dark. Can put Lakota ahead of him on the path and fought the upslope, and did what the high-pitched descent had taught him 3 days earlier, which was to put his own pace second and go on putting it second for as long as the descent lasted. Etchiaki held the switchback turns, where the path narrowed and only one of them could come at a time, and did it 4 times, and Can did not have to ask him once. They came off the mesa at first light with Lakota still walking. Thalia Amberhide met them at the post's edge, because Thalia Amberhide met everything at the post's edge, and she took one look and did not say anything at all, and put her arm around a woman she had known before all of this, and walked her in through a settlement that was standing up out of its bedrolls to watch. Arnak Grim Totem still held Dark Cloud Pinnacle. Can had not gone up there to take a mesa from a chieftain, and had known it going up. He had gone to take one person off it, and had taken one person off it, and the wound the post looked at every evening was exactly as open in the morning as it had been the night before. He found this, on reflection, to be the accurate shape of most of the good he had managed on the road so far. He stayed at Freewind Post for 2 more days before moving on, recovering in the practical sense while the tests settled into their permanent place in his understanding. The Wind Rider Master carried him out to the shimmering flats on the second day and brought him back before dark, because Thalia said a person should see them once, and because there would be no second chance. His road out of the canyon ran north, up the lift, and would not pass within 4 days' walk of them. They were not what he expected, and he stood at their edge for some time revising. It was a lake bed that was immediately and unarguably legible, an enormous flat pan of white crust running east toward the Tanaris border with nothing growing on it at all. The ground crazed into plates where it had dried and dried again, the whole expanse throwing back the sun with an intensity that made the eyes work. Water had been here. A great deal of water for a very long time, and then it had gone, and the going had been permanent. There was a ship in the northern part of it. He walked out to that because he could not walk out to it. A sailing vessel, timbers grey and split, sitting upright on white crust considerably further from open water than any ship has business being, with the specific dignity of a thing that had been doing exactly its job right up until the world had changed the terms underneath it. Further east there was noise. Goblins and gnomes had built a racing track out on the flat where the ground was hardest, and spent their days sending machines along it at speeds that produced, at regular intervals, a sound like a forge exploding, and a column of black smoke going straight up in still air. The wreckage of previous attempts lay scattered across a wide radius, along with craters. Can watched for an hour from a distance, he judged carefully and found sufficient, and could not decide whether what he was looking at was a serious enterprise or a shared and elaborate joke, and eventually concluded that the distinction probably did not exist for the people involved. He had spent a year learning water. The river at Camp Narek, the Baron's waterholes, the cold deep off Shadowpree, the slow green channels of Feralas, each one a dialect, each one asking to be learned separately, and he had assumed without ever examining the assumption that this was how the world worked and would go on working. Here the water had finished its business and left. What it left behind was not a lesser version of the same place. It was a different place entirely, with its own creatures and its own rules, and a ship stranded in the middle of it as the only remaining sentence in a language nothing here still spoke. He thought about the canyon floor and the scour and Taka in Feralas. Water came, he thought. Water went. The canyon had been both of those places, at different lengths of time, and would be again. The cooking at altitude required adjustments to everything Roke and Aska Mistrunna and Wulan had taught him. The variables different enough from anything he had cooked under before that the principles, rather than the particular applications, were what carried him through. He worked the adjustments out methodically and added the result to what his hands knew. On his last evening at the post, he sat at the communal fire among strangers, travellers passing through, a few of the post's regular braves, Hagar Lightninghoof in his customary position at the edge, and let the evening move around him the way Camp Narek's evenings had always moved around him, the talk drifting between subjects with the unself-conscious freedom of people who had nowhere urgent to be. Lakota Windsong was asleep somewhere behind him under a roof, which was more than had been true of her 2 nights ago, and less than the whole of what was owed her. He thought, watching the fire, about Dark Cloud Pinnacle still visible to the northwest in the last of the light, with the same fire burning on it that had burned there the night he went up. He thought about the Grim Totem woman somewhere in the deep forest of Feralas behind him, and the broken totem fragment still sitting at the bottom of his pack, and about how little of any of it had actually been settled by anything he had done. He did not have a resolution for any of it. He had decided, somewhere on the road, that some things were allowed to remain genuinely unresolved rather than merely unresolved for now, and this seemed to be one of them. He thought of Tamar, the delight she would have taken in being told that the fall from the planks had never been real at all, the immediate demand she would have made that someone explain the working behind it in full before she would consent to be impressed by anything else about the test. He thought of his mother's hands, steady on a piece of leather at the bench in their dwelling, and the particular quiet of Camp Narek at evening, very far from this canyon and its bridges and its old stone guardian broken now into fragments in a sack at the bottom of his pack. He thought too about Alu at Hypach, turning a wyvern egg with careful hands and asking whether taking and choosing wore the same name in the end. He did not think they did. but he understood why the question had occurred to someone who spent his days raising trust in creatures that had never been given the chance to withhold it. And he found that the question stayed with him longer than he expected a stranger's passing uncertainty to stay. The fire burned down. The strangers drifted off to sleep one at a time, the way fires emptied at every settlement he had ever sat beside. And eventually it was only Hagar and Can and Etchaki at the embers, the old brave looking at the dark shape of Dark Cloud Pinnacle with an expression Can could not fully read. Hagar said, "I have not thanked you." Can said, "You do not need to." "No," Hagar said. "I do not." He was quiet a while. It would not be the right size for it. Her brother was my sister's son. I have carried that for 2 years and had made my peace with carrying it for 20 more. And then a stranger went up the eastern face in the dark, and it turned out to be 11 strokes of a knife. He shook his head slowly. "I do not know what to do with a thing that small answering a thing that large." Can said it did not answer it. "No," Hagar said. "It did not." He was quiet a moment. "I did not tell you she was blood that first evening. People handle you differently once they know, and I wanted the account to stand on what happened rather than on who it happened to." They sat with that for a while. Then, still not turning from the mesa, he said, "Where does it take you from here?" "North," Can said. "Up the lift and then east." "There is a marsh out that way, I am told." "There is," Hagar said. "And past the marsh, whatever your road actually wants from you." He looked at Can for the first time since the fire had burned down. "The pinnacle will still be here, whenever it brings you back through. Some things wait. They do not need to be resolved on the first pass." Can said, "That is what I have been telling myself." Hagar made a small, dry sound, not quite a laugh, but the closest thing his face seemed willing to offer. On the 3rd morning he left Freewind Post. The pup followed them as far as the descent, and then stopped at the edge of the ground she understood and sat, and did not come further. Etchaki turned once at the first switchback and looked back up at her, and she did not move, and after a moment he went on. Can thought about it for a considerable distance afterward. It was the first time he had watched an animal choose a place over a companion, and he could not decide whether it had been a smaller thing than it looked, or a much larger one. The bridges fell behind, and the canyon narrowed toward its northern end and the Great Lift. He had ridden a lift before. He had ridden the Thunder Bluff lifts a dozen times in the weeks he spent there, and had thought, riding them, that he understood the arrangement. The Great Lift disabused him of this within about 4 heartbeats. It stood at the canyon's northern wall, an enormous wooden platform running on a frame that climbed the full height of the cliff to the Baron's plateau above, worked by a counterweight and a system of ropes as thick as his forearm, built by people who had needed to move Kodo and cargo and braves between 2 worlds that were 400 feet apart vertically. The Thunder Bluff lifts had descended an open cliff face, with the mesa's stone reassuringly close on one side. This one went up the middle of nothing. Within 20 feet of leaving the ground, there was open air on all 4 sides of the platform, and a canyon floor getting smaller underneath it. There was no rail on the eastern side. There had been. He could see where it had been. The brave working the winch mentioned, conversationally, that they had lost a full team of Kodo off it in the spring, and that the trick was to load animals facing inward and to never, under any circumstances, let a nervous one turn around at the halfway point where the wind came across the canyon mouth, and the whole platform started to describe a slow circle. He said it in the tone of a man discussing weather. Can noticed that he said it while both his hands stayed on the rope. Halfway up, the wind came across the canyon mouth, and the platform started to describe a slow circle. Can stood in the exact center with one hand flat on the deck boards and Etchaki lying pressed along his leg, and looked at the canyon rotating below him, the needles from above now, the spires he had crossed between reduced to a field of stone teeth, the scour on the floor legible along its whole length as a single pale line, and understood that he had spent a fortnight being tested by an old man on the subject of faith, and was currently being tested by a rope. He did not enjoy it. He was, however, extremely interested to notice that he did not enjoy it in a manner that left him fully able to think, which he was reasonably sure would not have been true of the version of himself that had walked into this canyon. The platform came up level with the plateau and the barrens opened out ahead of him, gold and enormous and entirely without vertical relief, and he stepped off onto ground that did not move and stood on it for a moment with genuine appreciation. He did not walk on immediately, because the wind came across the plateau and brought him the barrens, and the barrens was a smell he knew. Dry grass and hot dust, and the particular mineral note the ochre soil gave off in the late morning. Nothing about it was remarkable. He had lived inside it for months, and had stopped registering it entirely by the third week, the way a person stops registering the smell of their own dwelling. It had taken a year and 4 countries away from it for the smell to become information again. He stood at the lift head and understood that he was, for the first time since he had left Mulgore, walking into country he already knew. It was a stranger sensation than he had anticipated. The ground had not changed. The road ran where it had run. The dry washes cut the plain in the same places, and the acacia stood in the same scattered arrangement, and the heat did the same thing at the same hour of the afternoon that it had always done. Nothing here had spent the year becoming anything. What had changed was the reader. He noticed it within the first hour and kept noticing it, and eventually stopped being able to notice anything else. He was reading the wash country now the way he had learned to read the charred veil and the Farala's canopy and the vertical geometry of the needles. 3 levels at once, wind first, sight lines before comfort. A year ago he had walked this plane competently, and had thought competent was the whole of what there was. Now the same ground was handing him 4 times as much, and he understood that it had always been handing him that much, and that the shortfall had never been the barrens. He found this humbling in a way that did not feel bad. It seemed important that his first proof of having changed was not a thing he could do but a thing he could see. The southern barrens carried him northeast across 2.5 days. He passed the Quilboar country on the second morning, well south of the road. The thorn and bramble construction of their holdings visible at a distance he chose carefully and did not shorten. He thought about a boy in a Quilboar camp and about how far the road had come since then, and did not go any nearer, because there was no one down there to help this time, and the not going was the whole of what the situation asked from him. On the second afternoon, he reached the fork where the northern track ran up toward the crossroads. He stood at it for a while. Vex would be there or would not be. Fizwick would be there and would be selling something at a price that reflected a confident theory about the buyer. There would be a notice board with the same 3 kinds of notice on it, and a fire in the evening and travellers with news, and it would take him a day and a half and cost him nothing. He turned east. He examined the turning afterward for as long as the light lasted, because he had learned to be suspicious of decisions that arrived that quickly. What he found was not avoidance. He had gone to the crossroads the first time as a young hunter who needed somewhere to be told what the world contained. The board, the fire, the older hunters, the whole apparatus of a place that hands a beginner his next question. He did not need his next question handed to him anymore. He had a marsh ahead of him, and a craft that would want its material, and a 4th test, waiting in a place he had deliberately not been told, and the going back would have been going back to be a version of himself he had finished being. There would be a road through the crossroads again someday. There was no reason for it to be this one. Etchaki changed on the second night and can almost missed it. Nothing dramatic. He ate what he always ate and lay where he always lay, and read the camp's perimeter with the same comprehensive attention. But he lay facing north, and he had not chosen a direction to face at any camp in Farala's or Desilis or the canyon. And when Can woke in the small hours, the gold eyes were open and pointed at the same country. The white mist had happened somewhere far up there. Not on this road, and not within days of it. The northern barrens was a long way past the fork Can had just declined, and there was nothing in the world that would have taken him there on this passage. He watched the lion watch the north for a while, and did not intrude on it, and did not pretend to know what was in it. He said eventually out loud, because there was nobody else on the plain, and because it seemed like the kind of thing that ought to be said aloud, even if the saying was mostly for the sayer, "We will come back through. Not this season, but we will." Etchraki's ear moved. He did not turn from the north. In the morning he was himself again, entirely, and they went east. The ground began to change on the third day, and it changed the way real changes came, nothing announcing itself, only accumulation. The washes stopped being dry at the bottom. The grass, which had been the same brittle gold since the lift head, began to admit a different green at the margins, and then to admit it everywhere. The low hills that separated the plain from whatever lay beyond it rose ahead of him and then opened, and the road ran down through them, and the air coming up through the gap to meet him was carrying water. He did not know what waited ahead. He did not know the names of the places or the people the road would bring him to, only that it would bring him to them, the way it always had, and that he would meet what arrived with whatever he had built of himself by the time it arrived. Etshaki moved at his right side, gold eyes on the horizon, reading the new ground with the same comprehensive ease he brought to everything. The canyon was 3 days behind them now, and the needles had gone down out of sight one at a time on the morning he left, and the road turned toward the marsh. From the thoughts of ASHWALLOW.
I jumped, and the falling was never real. I have been turning this over since Dorn told me plainly that the entire test had been the jumping and not the landing, that whatever I believed waited below was never going to happen, that some working beyond my understanding had already decided the outcome before my body left the platform. I keep returning to this. The fear did not know that. The fear could not have known that, because knowing it would have made the test meaningless. I was afraid of something that was never going to occur, and the fear was no less real for the thing it feared being illusory. This seems important in a way I am still working out the edges of. Perhaps most fear is this: accurate in its intensity, inaccurate in its object, and the inaccuracy of the object does nothing to reduce what is asked of you in the moment you act anyway. I think about Tama saying, "Someday you will go find out." I did not know, jumping, what I would find out. I still do not entirely know, except that I found out something about the gap between what a body fears and what is actually true, and that the gap does not close the way I would have expected. You do not learn your way out of fear by learning that the particular fear was unfounded. You learn, instead, that fear and trust can occupy the same instant, and that acting from the trust while the fear is still fully present is the only version of courage that was ever actually available to me. 9 did not walk back up his ramp. He told me that while my shoulder was still knitting under his hands, and he told me deliberately, and I have decided to be grateful for the timing rather than resentful of it. I want to hold on to what actually happened in that den, plainly, because I can already feel the story sanding itself smooth. I did not defeat Grenka Bloodscreech. I survived her by half a second that Etshaki bought with his own flank, and the axe stroke that ended it was not skill. It was the last thing an emptied arm could still do. I gave him that order once on a cliff above the sea, and he refused it, and I have spent the month since half wishing I had been more persuasive. I am done wishing that. If the lesson had ever taken, if I had made him into an animal that leaves when I tell it to leave, then when the den turned, he would have gone, correctly, on my own instruction, and I would have died on that floor alone. I do not know what to do with that. It appears to mean that the thing I keep trying to give him, for his own protection, is the thing that would kill me. I have decided to stop trying to give it. That is either the correct conclusion or the beginning of how both of us end, and I do not currently have a way to tell which. Dorn said, "That is simply what you are." He was talking about the burial. I have been doing this since before the road, the fairy dragon's wing, the boy in the Quilboar camp, the man in Desolus. I do not perform this. I do not decide, each time, to be the kind of person who does this. I simply find that the alternative, walking past what is within my reach to help, has never once felt like a real option, only a theoretical one that other people apparently find easier to choose than I do. My mother said, "A hunter who cannot care for himself becomes a burden to everything that depends on him." I understand now the half of that instruction she never said aloud, trusting me to find it on my own. A hunter who can care and chooses not to when the caring is within reach is failing something that has no good name but is nonetheless real. Aluat Hyperch asked whether taking and choosing were the same name in the end. I do not think they do. The wyverns did not choose their handlers the way Etchaki chose me, or the way the rake chose me before him. But I understood why a careful boy raising trusting creatures would wonder about the difference, since the trust looks identical from outside the relationship, even when its origin is not identical at all. Dark Cloud Pinnacle is still there behind me, dark against the evening sky, and I have now stood on top of it, which has taught me almost nothing I wanted to learn. I expected the camp to explain something. It was a camp. Fires and hide shelters, and somebody's cooking pot in a cage. The people in it were people. That is the part I keep circling, that it looked exactly like a place where a person might live an ordinary life, and that the cage was standing in the middle of it, the way a well stands in the middle of a village, and that nobody up there appeared to find the arrangement remarkable. I am carrying the fragment in my pack still. I do not know why I have not set it down. Perhaps because setting it down would mean deciding something about what it means, and I have now seen enough to be certain I am not qualified to decide it. Hager said, "Some things wait. They do not need to be resolved on the first pass." I went up the pinnacle anyway, and came down it with one person and nothing else. And Arnak is still up there this morning with the same fire and the same braves and one empty cage. I have been trying to decide whether that is a success. I think the honest answer is that it is neither a success nor a failure but a category I did not have a name for until this week. The good that is available taken, while the larger wrong stays exactly where it was. Hager worked it out before I did, and told me plainly the night before I went. 19 braves could not take that mesa. A theft could take one person off it. Both of those are true, and the second does not fix the first, and I have stopped expecting the road to offer me the version where it does. The woman in Feralas is still somewhere west of Camp Majesh. Some things wait. I am learning that waiting is not the same as being abandoned, provided somebody is still counting them. Rakalim came apart into fragments too, though for an entirely different reason. I carried those back to Dorn, who had asked for them honestly, in service of a test that was honestly given. There is a fourth test, and I did not take it. Dorn named it, and then refused to tell me anything about where it lives except that it does not live here, and I chose to keep walking. I have turned this over for 3 days looking for the shape of the failure in it and have not found one, which I distrust slightly, because it is exactly the answer I wanted. What I keep returning to is what he said about carrying it. 3 facets of me have now been examined and one has not, and I know precisely which one, and knowing precisely which one is apparently the more useful condition. He said it is better company than certainty. I think what he meant is that a man who believes he has been fully measured stops looking, and a man who knows which part of himself is still unmeasured has to keep his eyes open in a particular direction for the rest of his life. The direction is the mind. What I was taught and who taught it and what was left out. I am not eager for it. I notice that I am not eager for it. And I notice that the not being eager is probably the whole reason it counts as a test. I do not know yet what is ahead. I am beginning to trust that this not knowing is simply the correct condition for someone walking the kind of road I am walking, and that the trusting of it, rather than the resolving of it, is the actual skill the whole of this journey has been quietly teaching me. Can ASHWALLOW